The iron rim of the stagecoach wheel struck a hidden rock, sending a violent shudder through the wooden frame that rattled Nora's teeth. She gripped the leather strap hanging from the ceiling, her knuckles turning white, matching the pallor that had lived on her face for the last 3 weeks. Outside the window, the Wyoming territory was a blur of endless, oppressive brown and gray. It was a landscape that did not care if you lived or died. And for the first time since she had boarded the train in Boston, Nora felt a strange, cold comfort in that indifference. She pulled the thin, wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was borrowed, or rather, taken from a donation bin in a church vestry in St. Louis, along with a faded calico dress that was 2 sizes too big for her slender frame. She was no longer Nora Hale, the society wife with the silk ribbons and the terror living behind her eyes. She was just a woman in the corner of a coach, a nobody with a carpet bag and a name she had invented 2 states back. The man opposite her, a drummer selling patent medicines who smelled of stale tobacco and peppermint, leaned forward. "You look pale." "Ma'am," he said, "the air out here gets thin, takes the breath right out of you if you are not born to it." Nora turned her gaze from the horizon, forcing a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "I am quite fine. Thank you," she said. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, stripped of the Eastern cadence she tried so hard to bury. The coach lurched again, harder this time, and the driver's shout cracked like a whip from the box above. The sky, which had been a bruised purple since noon, began to curdle into a heavy, suffocating white. The temperature dropped with a speed that felt unnatural, a sudden violence that stole the heat right out of the cabin. "Looks like a blow is coming on," the drummer muttered, wiping a circle of condensation from the glass. And a mean one. Within an hour, the world had vanished. The endless plains were erased by a curtain of driving snow that moved horizontally, hissing against the wood of the coach. The vehicle slowed to a crawl, the horses fighting against a wind that screamed like a living thing. Then, with a sickening crack that sounded louder than a gunshot, the coach listed sharply to the left. The world tilted. Nora was thrown against the door, her shoulder striking the wood hard enough to bruise. The coach ground to a halt. The door was wrenched open from the outside, and the driver's face appeared, wrapped in a scarf, crusted with ice. "Wheel is done for," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "We are stuck in a rut. Everyone out. We have to lighten the load if we want to get it to the station." Nora stumbled out into the white. The cold was a physical blow, a solid weight that pressed the air from her lungs. The snow did not fall. It drove into her skin like needles. Chaos erupted around the crippled vehicle. The other passengers were shouting, grabbing at trunks and boxes. Nora, disoriented by the biting wind, reached for a heavy crate, trying to do her share, trying to be useful so they would not look too closely at her. She took 3 steps back to gain leverage, her boots slipping on the slick, frozen mud beneath the snow. The wind gusted, a hammer blow of air that spun her around. She lost her footing and stumbled away from the coach. When she looked up, the vehicle was a dark smudge. She took a step toward it, but the wind pushed her sideways. She took another, squinting against the stinging ice, but the whiteout had swallowed the world. "Hello!" she screamed, but the sound was torn from her throat and shredded instantly by the gale. She turned in a circle, panic rising in her chest like bile. The direction of the coach was gone. The ruts in the road were filled in seconds. There was only the white, howling void. Nora began to walk. She told herself she just had to keep moving, that the way station was close, that someone would see her. But the snow filled her shoes, soaking her stockings with freezing water. The cold gnawed through the thin calico dress, biting deep into her muscle and bone. She passed the skeletal remains of a fence post, half buried, looking like the rib of some great, dead beast. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her feet grew heavy, then numb, then absent entirely. She was walking on stumps. Her breath came in shallow, searing gasps that burned her throat. The cold began to play tricks on her mind. The howling wind started to sound like voices. She crashed into a drift, the snow rising to her waist. Her legs refused to lift again. She collapsed forward, her cheek pressing against the ice. It was almost warm. She thought that was the danger. It felt like sleep. As her eyes drifted shut, the white planes dissolved. She was back in the parlor, the gas lamps hissing. The heavy scent of brandy and cigar smoke choked her. She saw him standing there, his face twisted in that familiar, terrifying rage. She saw the heavy crystal decanter in his hand. She felt the impact before it happened, the shattering glass, the blood. Then came the silence, and after the silence, the accusation, murderous. The walls whispered, unnatural woman. She saw the judge's eyes, cold as this Wyoming winter. She saw the noose they wanted to put around her neck because a woman had no right to survive if it meant hurting a man of standing. No, she whimpered into the snow. I only wanted to live. The darkness edged in, softer than the memories. She stopped fighting. The cold was a blanket now, pulling her down into a deep, dreamless quiet where he could never hurt her again. Then, the earth shook. A vibration traveled through the snow, rhythmic and heavy. A shadow detached itself from the storm, towering over her. A horse, a massive, snorting beast with ice clinging to its mane. A figure vaulted from the saddle. He was a giant in a battered oilskin slicker. His hat pulled low. He did not speak. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply bent down, his movements hampered by the wind but undeniably strong. Hands encased in thick leather gloves, grabbed her by the waist and the collar of her coat. He hauled her up from the snow as if she weighed no more than a sack of grain. Nora tried to protest, tried to flail, but her limbs were frozen useless. Hold on, a voice growled near her ear. It was a rough sound, like gravel grinding together. He practically threw her across the front of his saddle, mounting behind her in one fluid motion. He wrestled the reins with one hand and wrapped his other arm around her, pinning her against his chest. The heat radiating from him was shocking. A furnace blast against her frozen back. Damn foolishness! He cursed softly. The words lost to the wind but felt as a vibration against her spine. The horse surged forward, fighting the drifts. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness. The world was a rhythmic jarring, the smell of wet wool and horse sweat, and the iron band of the stranger's arm keeping her from falling into the void. Time lost its meaning. It might have been hours or minutes before the horse stopped. Through slitted eyes, Nora saw the dark outline of a structure, a low cabin tucked against the lee of a rocky ridge that broke the wind's fury. The man slid down and pulled her off the horse, her legs folded beneath her. Useless pillars of ice. He caught her before she hit the ground, sweeping her up into his arms. He kicked the door open, carrying her into a gloom that smelled of wood smoke and stale air. He kicked the door shut behind them, sealing out the scream of the storm. The silence inside was sudden and ringing. He carried her to a narrow bunk against the far wall and laid her down. Nora shivered violently, her teeth clattering together so hard her jaw ached. She tried to curl into a ball, but the man was there, his hands moving with brisk, terrifying efficiency. "We have to get these wet things off," he said, not a request, a statement of fact. Fear spiked through her lethargy. She tried to bat his hands away. "No," she gasped. "No, please." He ignored her feebly flailing hands. He unbuttoned the sodden coat, stripping it off. Then he reached for the laces of her boots. He worked quickly, impersonal as a doctor. He pulled the boots off, then the soaked stockings, rubbing her icy feet with a rough friction that made her cry out in pain as the blood began to return. He stood, looming over her in the dim light. "You stay in those wet skirts. You will lose your legs or your life." "Ma'am?" Before she could protest again, he turned his back, rummaging in a wooden chest. He threw a heavy, scratchy wool blanket over her, then another. "Get the dress off under the blankets," he ordered. His back still turned as he knelt before the cold iron stove. "And be quick about it. I'm going to get a fire going." Nora, shaking uncontrollably, fumbled with the buttons of her bodice beneath the heavy wool. It was an agonizing task with numb fingers, but the fear of freezing outweighed the shame. She stripped down to her chemise and petticoats, pushing the wet bundle of the dress to the floor. She wrapped the blankets tight around her, cocooning herself until only her face showed. The sound of a match striking flared in the dark. A moment later, the smell of burning pine pitch filled the small room. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows against the log walls. Nora watched the stranger. He stood and shrugged out of his slicker. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a rough flannel shirt and a vest that had seen better years. He moved with a stiff, weary grace. He did not look at her. He picked up a lantern, lit it from the stove, and turned toward the door. "I have to see to the horse," he said. "Don't go to sleep yet." He went out into the storm, leaving her alone with the fire. Nora lay there, the heat slowly seeping into her bones. The pain of the thaw was excruciating, 1,000 needles pricking her skin. But beneath the pain, her mind began to sharpen. She was in a stranger's cabin, miles from nowhere, with a man she did not know, a man who was strong enough to break her in half if he chose. But he had saved her. He had covered her. He had turned his back. The door opened again, bringing a gust of snow. He entered, stamping his boots. He hung the lantern on a nail and moved to the stove, setting a blackened coffee pot on the iron plate. He finally turned to look at her. In the lantern light, his face came into focus. He was not an old man, perhaps 30 or so, but the West had written a hard history on him. His face was weathered, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. A pale, jagged scar ran from his hairline down to his left cheekbone, disappearing into the stubble of his jaw. His eyes were dark, guarded, and tired. "You alive over there?" he asked. His voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Yes," Nora whispered. He nodded once, as if that was all the conversation required. He pulled a wooden stool near the stove and sat, extending his hands toward the heat. "Name is Eli Carter," he said, looking at the fire. "Not her. I ride for the Double Star Ranch. This is just a line cabin. Not much, but it keeps the wind out." Nora swallowed, her throat dry and sore. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. You saved my life." He shrugged, a slight movement of one shoulder. "Couldn't leave you out there. A dog wouldn't deserve that." He turned his head then, his dark eyes fixing on her. "What is your name?" "Ma'am. And what in God's name were you doing walking in a blizzard in shoes made of paper?" Nora hesitated. The lie was a reflex now. But looking at this man, with his scarred face and honest, brutal rescue, the full fabrication felt wrong. "Nora," she said. "Just Nora?" "Nora. Lee, it was her middle name. It would have to do. And I was on the stagecoach," she added quickly. "A wheel broke. I got separated in the whiteout." Eli looked at her for a long moment. His gaze dropped to the pile of wet clothes on the floor, then back to her face. He looked at her hands, which were clutching the blanket, hands that were red and chapped now, but still slender, with the nails that had been manicured not long ago. They were not the hands of a woman who worked for her bread. He grunted. "Well, Nora Lee, you are stuck here. This storm has got a tail on it. Could be 2 days, could be 4. He poured coffee into a tin cup and held it out to her. She had to reach a hand out from the blankets to take it. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was rough, callous against her softness. He pulled back instantly, as if he had been burned. "Drink," he said. "It will warm your insides." The storm raged for 3 days. The cabin was a small world, barely 10 feet by 12. The wind screamed relentlessly, piling snow against the single window until the light inside was a perpetual, gloomy gray. They existed in a strange, suspended reality. They ate beans from a tin can and drank bitter coffee that tasted like metal. The intimacy of the space was unavoidable. There was no privacy. When Nora had to dress or attend to her needs, Eli would step into the lean-to with the horse, standing in the freezing cold until she knocked on the wall. They moved around each other like ghosts in a cage. When he moved to stir the fire, she had to pull her legs in. When she stood to stretch her aching limbs, he had to shift his stool. They brushed shoulders a dozen times a day, each time. Nora flinched, her body remembering violence. Each time. Eli froze, his jaw tightening, before he moved away slowly, showing her his hands were empty. They spoke little, but the silence began to lose its edge. He mended his gear by the firelight, his large hands surprisingly dexterous with a needle and thread. Nora watched him. She saw the way he winced sometimes when he moved his left shoulder, an old injury that the cold aggravated. "You have a light touch," she said once, watching him repair a tear in his stirrup leather. "Have to," he muttered without looking up. "A heavy hand ruins a horse. You have to be steady." He did not ask about her past. He saw the way she jumped at the sound of a popping log. He heard the Eastern refinement in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. He knew she was running. In this country, half the men were running from a lawman and the other half from a memory. He figured women had their reasons too. On the second night, the nightmare came. Nora was back in the courtroom. The gavel banged, sounding like a gunshot. Her husband was laughing, blood pouring from his head, telling everyone she was mad, that she belonged in an asylum. He reached for her, his fingers turning into claws. "No!" she screamed, thrashing against the blankets. "Don't touch me! I didn't do it!" She woke gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, save for the dying embers in the stove. She was sitting bolt upright, sweat cooling on her skin. "Nora!" The voice was low, calm, not a shout. She whipped her head around. Eli was sitting on the edge of her bunk. He wasn't touching her. His hands were resting on his own knees, visible in the faint red glow. He was just there, a barrier between her and the dark. "You are all right," he said. You are in the cabin. The door is barred. Nothing is getting in here." Nora dragged air into her lungs, trembling. "I had a dream, I know," he said. Sounded like a bad one. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. "I am sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." Eli shifted. He hesitated, his hand lifting slightly, hovering near her shoulder. He paused there, waiting, asking without words. Nora looked at his hand. It was big, scarred, capable of violence, but it hung there, steady and patient. She gave a small, jerky nod. He lowered his hand, his palm settling on her shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. It was warm and solid. He didn't stroke her or squeeze. He just let her feel that he was there, an anchor in the spinning room. "Just breathe," he said softly. "The wind is dying down. Listen." She listened. The screaming howl had dropped to a low moan. "You are safe here, Nora," he said. The tears came then, sudden and hot. She leaned into his touch, just an inch. The simple, undemanding kindness of it broke something open inside her. She wanted to weep for the cruelty she had fled and the mercy she had found in this rough, frozen place. He stayed there until her breathing evened out, until she lay back down. He pulled the blanket up to her chin, his knuckles grazing her jaw. "Go to sleep," he whispered. "I will keep watch." The next morning, the sun broke through. It was a blinding, brilliant light that reflected off the white world. Eli went out early to dig out the door. When he came back in, the air smelled crisp and clean. "Storms broke," he said, pouring the last of the coffee. "We can ride out today." Nora felt a sudden, sharp pang of panic. The cabin had been a sanctuary. Out there was the world. Out there were telegraphs and sheriffs and wanted posters. "Where will we go?" she asked. "I am heading to the Double Star," Eli said. "It is a day's ride. The boss, Mr. Jensen. He is a fair man. His wife Mary runs the house. They are usually looking for help come spring. Housekeeping, cooking. It is hard work, but it pays." Nora stared into her cup. "A ranch, a place to hide in plain sight." "I don't have any references," she said, "and I don't know anything about ranching." Eli looked at her. He leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "You survived 3 days in a line cabin with nothing but beans and a stranger," he said. "You have got grit. Nora, Mary will see that. And as for references," he paused, looking down at his boots. "I will vouch for you. I will tell them you are a cousin of a friend, or whatever you want me to say." Nora looked up at him. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be—" She stopped. "I could be a murderess." Eli met her gaze. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but his voice was soft. "I know enough," he said. "I know you are scared. And I know you are not looking to hurt anyone. You are just looking for a place to rest your feet." He straightened up. "Besides, I need the company on the ride back." That final evening, the mood in the cabin shifted. The survival terror was gone, replaced by a tension that hummed in the air like a plucked wire. Nora sat on the bunk, folding the blankets. Eli was by the stove, oiling the bridle leather. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Nora watched his hands working the leather. She thought about the weight of his palm on her shoulder the night before. She thought about how, for the first time in years, she hadn't felt the need to check the exits when a man entered the room. She realized, with a jolt of terror, that she didn't want to leave this tiny, smoke-stained room. She realized she was watching the line of his jaw, the way his hair curled over his collar. She looked up and found him watching her. His hands had stilled on the bridle. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, making the scar stand out starkly. But his eyes were open, unguarded for the first time. There was a hunger there, raw and lonely, that matched the hollow ache in her own chest. For a moment, neither of them breathed. The distance between them, 5 feet of rough timber floor, felt charged. If she moved, if she took one step, everything would change. Nora's heart hammered a frantic rhythm. She wanted to cross that space. She wanted to feel that warmth again. "No," a voice whispered in her head. "You are poison. Nora, you ruin everything you touch. You cannot drag this man into your darkness." She tore her gaze away, turning sharply to the wall. I should pack the food," she stammered, her voice breathless. She heard Eli let out a long, slow breath. The leather creaked as he picked up the bridle again. "Yeah," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "We ride at first light. Best get some rest." They left at dawn. The world was carved from ice and sapphire sky. The sagebrush was crystallized, glittering like diamonds. The mountains in the distance were jagged teeth biting into the blue. Nora rode behind Eli, perched on the rump of the massive horse. There was no saddle for her, so she had to hold on to him. Her arms were wrapped around his waist, her hands clasped against his stomach. She could feel every shift of his muscles as he guided the horse. She pressed her cheek against the worn wool of his coat, shielding her face from the biting wind. The heat of his body soaked into her, a steady, rhythmic warmth that felt dangerously like safety. She closed her eyes, letting herself have this one moment, just this ride. "It is temporary," she promised herself, "just until I get to the ranch, just until I can save enough money to keep running. I will not stay. I will not let him get close." But as the horse trudged through the snow, carrying them toward a future she couldn't yet see, Nora's arms tightened instinctively around him, holding on for dear life. The Double Star Ranch was not the kingdom Nora had conjured in her mind during the long, rattling silence of the ride down from the high country. She had pictured green pastures and perhaps a white-painted house with a porch that wrapped around like a welcoming arm. What she saw, as Eli guided the horses over the final rise, was a collection of buildings that looked as though they were huddled together for warmth against the vast, indifferent sky. The main house was a low, weather-beaten structure of gray timber, its roofline sagging slightly under the memory of heavy snows. The barn leaned drunkenly to the west, braced by fresh logs that looked like crutches. The corrals were muddy scars on the earth, and the cattle that milled within them were thin, their ribs showing like the rungs of a ladder through their winter coats. It was a place of hard luck and harder work, stripped of romance, standing naked against the wind. Eli glanced back at her, his expression guarded, perhaps expecting her to recoil. "It is not much to look at," he said, his voice fighting the breeze. "But the roof holds water and the stove draws well." Nora tightened her grip around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his coat. "It is better than where I was," she said, and she meant it. They rode into the yard, the dogs barking a ragged welcome. A man emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. He was older than Eli, with a face like a dried apple and a back permanently bent from years in the saddle. This was Mr. Jensen. Following him from the house was a woman who moved with the brisk, no-nonsense stride of someone who had never wasted a minute in her life. Eli swung down and helped Nora from the horse. Her legs wobbled as they hit the ground, the muscles trembling from the strain of the ride. "Boss," Eli said, nodding to the man. "Made it back." "I see that," Jensen said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "And I see you did not come back alone." "This is Nora Lee," Eli said. His voice was steady, daring them to question him. "Found her stranded at the way station." Storm took the wheel off the stage. "She is looking for work. The woman, Mary Jensen," stepped forward. She was a small woman, wiry and strong, with gray hair pulled back so tight it pulled the skin at her temples. Her eyes were sharp, the color of flint, and they swept over Nora with a terrifying precision. She saw the borrowed, ill-fitting coat. She saw the pale, city-soft skin. She saw the way Nora stood, slightly behind Eli, like a frightened foal. "Work?" Mary asked, her voice dry. "You do not look like you have ever scrubbed a floor in your life. Girl." Nora straightened her spine. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but desperation was a powerful fuel. "I learned fast. Mrs. Jensen," Nora said. "I can cook and I can clean." "I am not afraid of work." Mary narrowed her eyes. She looked from Nora to Eli, reading the silent protective stance of the cowboy. She suspected there was a story there, a tragedy or a scandal. But out here, questions were a luxury nobody could afford. If the girl was running, she would either keep running or she would drop. "We can't pay much," Mary said finally. "Room and board and $10 a month. You will be up before the sun, and you will work until after it is down. If you cannot pull your weight, you will be back on that stagecoach before the week is out." "I understand," Nora said. "Thank you." The first week was a blur of exhaustion that bordered on torture. Nora was given a small room off the kitchen, barely big enough for a cot and a washstand, but it had a door she could lock, and that alone made it a palace. The romance of the West died the first morning she had to pump water. The iron handle of the pump was frozen, biting into her palms like teeth. She had to pour boiling water over it just to get it moving, and then haul the heavy buckets 50 yards to the house, the water sloshing over her boots and freezing instantly. Her hands, once praised for their elegance at Boston dinner parties, became her enemies. The lye soap she used for the laundry stripped the oils from her skin until her knuckles cracked and bled. Hanging wet sheets on the line in a freezing wind was a battle. The fabric stiffened into boards of ice before she could get the pins in, whipping against her face, stinging like a slap. Yet, there was a grim satisfaction in the pain. When she fell into her cot at night, every muscle screaming, she did not dream of the judge or her husband. She slept the heavy, black sleep of the dead. The blisters on her palms were proof of her existence. They were ugly, red, and raw, but they were hers. She was earning her keep. She was free. Eli kept his distance during the day, busy with the cattle and the endless repairs the ranch demanded. But he was always there on the periphery. If a heavy sack of flour needed moving, he appeared silently to lift it. If the wood box was empty, he filled it before she could ask. It was the trips to town that tested her resolve the most. 2 weeks in, Mary took Nora into the settlement to buy supplies. The town was a strip of false-fronted buildings clinging to the dust, populated by people who had nowhere else to go. As Nora walked the boardwalk behind Mary, carrying a basket of eggs to trade, she felt the eyes of the town upon her. The women were the worst. They gathered in tight knots, their bonnets leaning together like conspiring crows. They looked at Nora's faded calico dress, her red hands, and the way she kept her eyes on the ground. They did not see a worker. They saw a woman without a man. A woman who had arrived with a cowboy in the mercantile. Nora reached for a bolt of fabric, her sleeves slipping up to reveal the bruising on her wrist from where she had banged it against the door frame. A woman beside her, the banker's wife, pulled her skirts away as if Nora were contagious. "Some people bring their trouble with them," the woman whispered loudly to her companion. "You can see it in the way she carries herself. No ring, but the look of a wife." Nora froze, her hand hovering over the blue cotton. Shame, hot and familiar, flooded her cheeks. Later, while loading the wagon, a girl spilled out of the saloon's back door. She was dressed in bright, garish satin, her face painted, lighting a cheroot. She leaned against the railing and watched Nora struggle with a sack of grain. "Don't let them get to you." "Honey," the girl called out. Her voice was raspy. "They look at me the same way. You have got the look of someone who has already been judged. Takes one to know one." Nora stiffened. To be compared to a fallen woman was a blow she hadn't expected. She climbed onto the wagon seat, staring straight ahead, her jaw set so hard it ached. Eli was riding escort that day, sitting on his horse a few yards away. He had heard it. He heard everything. Nora saw his hand drop to his thigh, not to his gun, but resting there, his fist clenching until the leather of his glove creaked. He did not look at the saloon girl. He rode up beside the wagon, positioning his large horse between Nora and the street, blocking the view of the gawkers. "You all right?" he asked quietly, looking at the horizon. Nora nodded, not trusting her voice. "They do not know you." "Nora," he said, "their words are just wind." It was the brutality of the landscape that eventually forged a truce between Nora and her new life. You could not worry about social standing when the prairie was trying to kill you. One afternoon, a spark from the chimney landed in the dry winter grass near the house. Nora was the first to see the wisp of smoke. She didn't think. She screamed for Mary and grabbed a wet burlap sack. Running out into the yard, the fire was small but hungry, feeding on the dead grass, spreading in a widening circle. Nora beat at the flames, the smoke stinging her eyes, the heat singeing her eyebrows. She stomped and thrashed, coughing, terror lending her strength. By the time Eli and the men galloped in from the pasture, Nora and Mary had beaten the blackened circle into submission. Nora stood amidst the soot, her face smeared with black, her dress ruined, her chest heaving. Eli rode up, sliding his horse to a halt. He looked at the charred ground, then at Nora. "You did good," he said. Nora looked at her hands. They were trembling. Soot worked deep into the cracks of her skin. She looked up at him and smiled, a white flash in her darkened face. "I didn't let it take the house," she said. Eli smiled back, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "No, Nora, you surely didn't." After that, Eli decided she needed to learn to ride properly. "You cannot live out here and not be able to sit a horse," he told her. "If you get stranded, you need to know how to get home." The lessons began on Sunday afternoons, the only time the ranch work slowed. He saddled an older mare for her, a gentle beast named Bess. But to Nora, the animal seemed like a monster. The ground looked miles away. "Relax," Eli commanded, riding beside her. His voice was low, a calming rumble. "You are stiff as a board. The horse feels that. She thinks you are scared, so she gets scared." "I'm scared," Nora admitted, gripping the saddle horn until her knuckles turned white. Eli chuckled softly. He nudged his horse closer until his knee brushed against hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, sudden and electric. "Look at the horizon, not the ground." He said, "Move with her." "It is a dance." "Nora, just a dance." They were riding along a dry creek bed when a jackrabbit exploded from the brush. Bess shied violently to the left. Nora screamed, losing her stirrup, sliding dangerously to the side. Panic seized her. She was going to fall. She was going to be crushed. Eli moved with the speed of a striking snake. He spurred his horse forward, jamming his mount against the side of hers. He dropped his reins and reached out, his strong arm wrapping around her waist, hauling her back into the center of the saddle. He grabbed her reins, pulling Bess's head up. "Whoa!" he barked. "Easy now." The horses danced together, flanks bumping. Eli didn't let go. His arm was a band of iron around her ribs. For a long moment, they were pressed together, thigh to thigh, shoulder to shoulder. Nora could feel his heart hammering against her arm. She could smell the scent of him, tobacco, leather, and sweat. She looked up at him, her breath coming in short gasps. His face was inches from hers. The fear in his eyes surprised her. He wasn't afraid of the horses. He was afraid for her. "You stayed on," he breathed. Nora nodded, unable to speak. The air between them was suddenly thin. The vast emptiness of the prairie fell away, leaving only the two of them and the heat where their bodies touched. Eli slowly loosened his grip, though his hand lingered on her waist for a second longer than necessary before he pulled back. He cleared his throat, looking away toward the distant hills. "That is enough for today," he said, his voice gruff. "Let's get back." As the weeks turned into a month, the evenings became their sanctuary. After the dishes were done and the sun had dipped below the rim of the world, Nora would sit on the porch steps, wrapping her shawl against the chill. Eli would often join her, sitting on the railing, whittling a piece of cedar or just smoking a cigarette. They talked about safe things at first. The stars. The way the wind sounded different when snow was coming. A hollow, whistling sound versus the sharp bite of a clear night. "It feels so big out here," Nora said one evening, looking up at the Milky Way, which was a spilled bucket of diamond dust across the black sky. "It makes you feel insignificant. That is the point." "I reckon," Eli said. "Out here, a man, or a woman, is just what they do. The land does not care who your daddy was or what mistakes you made. It only cares if you can survive the winter." Nora pulled her knees to her chest. "It is lonely, though." Eli was silent for a long time. The cherry of his cigarette glowed bright, then faded. "I had a brother," he said suddenly. "Caleb. He was younger, wilder." Nora turned to look at him. He rarely spoke of his past. "What happened to him?" she asked softly. "Cattle drive, 5 years back, down near the Red River." Eli tossed the cigarette butt into the dirt and crushed it with his heel. He was riding point. "Storm came up, spooked the herd, 3,000 head of cattle running blind in the dark." He paused, his voice tight. "I was riding flank. I heard him yell. I tried to get to him, but you cannot stop a river of beef. By the time I found him, there wasn't much left to bury." Nora felt a hollow ache in her chest. "I am so sorry. Eli, I blamed myself for a long time," he said, looking at his hands. "Still do, some nights. Should have been me riding point. He was just a kid. He had a girl waiting for him in Abilene." He looked at Nora then, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "That is why I stay here. I suppose the quiet helps, and there is no one relying on me to keep them alive. Until now." The weight of his words hung in the air. Until now. He meant her. Nora reached out, her hand hovering, then settling lightly on his forearm. "You saved me, Eli. You did what you couldn't do for Caleb." Eli looked at her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away this time. He just nodded, a small, jerky motion. The weather turned in late February. The sky turned a sickly, bruised yellow-brown in the middle of the day. The wind died, leaving a terrifying, breathless silence. Then, the wall of dust hit. It was not snow. It was the earth itself rising up to swallow them. The sky went black. "Dust storm!" Jensen bellowed from the barn. Nora and Eli scrambled to help secure the shutters. The wind howled with a demonic shriek, driving grit through every crack in the wood. They stuffed rags under the doors, but the dust was like water. It found a way in. They retreated to the kitchen, the heart of the house. Mary and Mr. Jensen were in the parlor, checking the windows. Nora and Eli were alone amidst the flower bins and the hanging herbs. The air in the room was hazy with fine silt. Nora coughed, covering her mouth with her apron. Her face was smudged with dirt, her eyes watering. "This is hateful," she choked out. "It is in my teeth." Eli was checking the latch on the back door. A sudden gust slammed against the house, shaking the timbers. The floor violently vibrated. Nora lost her balance, stumbling over a loose floorboard. She fell forward. Eli turned and caught her. His hands gripped her waist, stopping her fall. The momentum slammed her against his chest. She grabbed his shirt to steady herself. They froze. Outside, the world was screaming. Inside, the only sound was their ragged breathing. They were covered in dust, looking like statues carved from the earth. Nora looked up into his face. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown black. She could feel the heat of him through the layers of clothes, the hard wall of his chest. The wanting hit her like a physical blow. It was not polite or gentle. It was a fierce, desperate hunger to be held, to be kissed, to be possessed by something other than fear. Eli's hands tightened on her waist. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back to her eyes. The conflict in his face was painful to watch. The battle between the man who wanted her and the man who believed he was too broken to have her. Nora parted her lips, a silent invitation. Eli's jaw muscles bunched. He closed his eyes for a second, a look of almost agony crossing his face. Then, he slowly, deliberately, let her go. He stepped back, putting 3 feet of floor between them. He wiped a hand across his mouth, leaving a streak in the dust. "I need to check the barn," he said, his voice raspy. "But you cannot go out there," Nora protested, reaching for him. "Eli." He didn't look back. He opened the door, letting a swirl of brown choke the room, and vanished into the storm. The dust settled, but the air between them remained charged. And with the clearing skies came the gossip. It started as a trickle, a look here, a whisper there. But it came to a head in the general store a week later. Nora was in the back, looking at canned peaches, hidden by a stack of crates. 2 women, Mrs. Miller and the pastor's wife, were at the counter. That Carter fellow is always with her. Mrs. Miller said, "It is not natural, living in the same house." "And where did she come from?" the pastor's wife added. "No family, no history, just showed up in a blizzard. Mark my words. She is a runaway. Probably left a husband or a debt. A woman doesn't run west unless she has a ruined past. Ruined," the word hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Nora stood frozen behind the crates, clutching a can of peaches until the metal bit into her palm. They were guessing, but they were so close to the truth it made her blood run cold. If they dug, they would find out. And if they found out, they wouldn't just hurt her. They would destroy Eli. They would say he was harboring a criminal, a murderess. She left the store without buying anything, slipping out the back. That night, she started pulling away. When Eli entered the kitchen, she made an excuse and went to her room. When he sat on the porch, she stayed inside, darning socks by the dim lamp. She avoided his eyes at supper. Eli noticed. Of course he noticed. He watched her with a confused, hurt expression, like a dog that had been kicked for no reason, but he respected her silence. He thought perhaps he had offended her in the storm. He retreated into his own shell, the silence between them growing into a canyon. It broke on a Tuesday. The wind was sharp enough to peel paint. They had spent the day repairing the north fence line. Nora's hands, which had started to heal, had cracked open again in the cold. The blood had stuck to her gloves. Eli found her in the barn after supper. She was sitting on a hay bale, a bowl of warm water and a strip of clean linen beside her. She was struggling to wrap a bandage around her right hand, using her teeth to pull the knot tight, tears of frustration and pain streaming down her face. She didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell over her. "Let me," he said. Nora jumped, wiping her eyes hastily. "I can do it. It is fine." Eli ignored her. He knelt in the straw beside her. He took the linen strip from her shaking fingers. "Stop fighting, Nora," he said softly. He took her hand in his. His hands were rough, scarred, and calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He unwound the messy bandage she had attempted. He dipped a cloth in the water and cleaned the split knuckles, his movements precise and tender. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. The barn was dark and warm, smelling of horses and hay. The way he bowed his head over her hand, treating her damaged skin like it was precious, broke her defenses. "Why do you do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why are you so good to me?" Eli didn't look up. He continued winding the fresh bandage. Because you are worth it, he said simply. The tears spilled over. I am tired. Eli, she confessed, the words rushing out. I am so tired of being afraid. I am tired of running. I am tired of people looking at me like I am dirt. She was sobbing now, the months of terror and loneliness pouring out, driven by an instinct she couldn't control. Nora leaned forward. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, hiding her face in the rough wool of his coat. Eli went still. For a heartbeat, he did nothing. Then, his arms came up. They hesitated, hovering, before closing around her. He pulled her against his chest. It was firm and unyielding. He held her tight, one hand on her back, the other cradling the back of her head. They stayed like that for a long time. The only sound was the horses chewing in their stalls and the rhythm of their breathing falling into sync. Nora felt the spark flare. It started in her chest and spread like wildfire. The scent of him filled her senses. She could feel the heavy thud of his heart against her cheek. She shifted slightly, pressing closer, her hand clutching his lapel. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to claim her. She lifted her head, her face inches from his. Her eyes searched his, asking, pleading. Eli looked at her. His eyes were dark pools of desire, burning with a heat that matched her own. His hand slid up to cup her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. He leaned in. Nora's breath hitched, but he didn't take her mouth. Instead, he leaned his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of her hair. Then, he kissed the top of her head, a soft, lingering pressure that was more intimate than any passionate embrace. Not like this, he whispered into her hair. You are vulnerable. Nora, I won't take advantage of that. I am not that man. He pulled back, his hands lingering on her arms to steady her. You get some sleep, he said, his voice thick. Nora watched him leave the barn, her body humming, her heart aching with a mixture of frustration and a soaring, terrifying love. After that night, the walls were down. They didn't speak of it, but everything had changed. They moved around the house like a binary star system, gravitating toward each other. When Nora passed him a plate of biscuits at supper, their fingers would brush, and the contact would linger for a second too long. Across the table, their eyes would meet, and a small, private smile would pass between them, a secret language that excluded the Jensens and the rest of the world. Mary noticed. She watched them with a knowing, tight-lipped expression, but she said nothing. It was a fragile normalcy, a bubble of happiness blown from glass, shimmering and thin. Nora began to believe, just a little, that maybe she could have this. Maybe the past stayed in the past, but the past has long legs. It was late March when a stranger rode into town. He was a man who looked like he was made of gristle and bad intentions, wearing a coat that had seen better days and a gun belt that was well-oiled. He tied his horse outside the mercantile. He walked up to the community board where notices for stray cattle and church socials were tacked up. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of paper. He pinned it to the wood with a heavy thumbtack. It was a wanted poster. The paper was cheap, but the sketch was good. The artist had captured the arch of the eyebrows, the curve of the mouth. Wanted. The bold letters screamed. For the murder of Jonathan Hale, reward offered, a local ranch hand, loading supplies into a wagon nearby. Stopped to look. He squinted at the sketch. Then he turned his head, looking down the street to where the Carter ranch wagon was parked. Nora was there, lifting a sack of flour. The ranch hand looked at the sketch. He looked at Nora. He looked back at the sketch. The recognition dawned on his face, slow and inevitable. Eli was inside the store, paying for nails. He didn't see the poster. He didn't see the man staring. Nora laughed at something the storekeep said, a rare, bright sound. She didn't feel the shadow falling over her. She didn't know that the noose she had run 1,000 miles to escape had just been thrown. And this time, it was pulling tight. The morning light was usually the one thing Nora could trust. It washed over the high plains in a wave of pale gold, promising that the darkness of the night had passed. But on this Tuesday, The sun brought no warmth. It only illuminated the grim set of Mary Jensen's jaw as she rode the buckboard into the yard, pulling the reins with a violence that made the horses toss their heads. Nora was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the midday biscuits. Her hands were dusted with flour, the rhythm of the work a comfort she had grown to rely on. The back door opened, letting in a gust of cold air. But Mary did not close it immediately. She stood in the frame, her silhouette sharp against the bright dust of the yard. Nora looked up, a smile forming on her lips, but it died instantly when she saw Mary's face. The older woman looked pale, her skin like parchment stretched over bone. In her hand, she clutched a piece of paper, folded into a tight square. Mary walked to the table and laid the paper down. She did not smooth it out. She merely placed her hand over it, trapping it against the wood. "I went to the post office," Mary said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual brisk efficiency. This was tacked up on the wall. Nora felt the blood drain from her face, rushing to her feet until she felt dizzy. She stared at Mary's weathered hand, the veins standing out blue and stark. She knew what was under it. "Is there anything you need to tell me, Nora?" Mary asked, "before I decide if you can stay under my roof?" Nora's hands were shaking. She wiped the flour onto her apron, the white dust leaving ghostly streaks on the fabric. She reached out and pulled the paper free. It was cheap newsprint, but the ink was black and damning. The sketch was crude, yet undeniable. It captured the curve of her jaw, the wide set of her eyes, beneath the face. Bold block letters screamed the accusation. "Wanted for murder." Nora's stomach dropped as if she had stepped off a cliff. The room swayed. The smell of yeast and coffee turned sour in her throat. "It is not what it says," Nora whispered. The sound was so faint it barely carried across the table. Mary pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. She looked old. Suddenly, "That is a federal charge. Nora, murder. They say you killed a man in Boston. I didn't," Nora choked out. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and blinding. "I swear to you, Mary, I didn't kill him." "Then tell me the truth," Mary commanded. "And do not lie to me, girl. I have given you a home. I have trusted you with my kitchen and my life. You owe me the truth." Nora gripped the edge of the table. She could not tell it all. The full weight of the shame was too heavy to lift. Even now. "I was married," Nora said, her voice trembling. "To a man named Richard. He was a powerful man, a cruel man." She looked down at the flour on the floorboards. "There was a struggle. One night, a man died. But it was not murder. I was trying to get away. Richard and his friends. They own the judges. They own the police. They said I did it. They said I was mad." She looked up at Mary, pleading. "I had to run. If I stayed, they would have hanged me, or worse." Mary studied her. She saw the terror in the younger woman's eyes, a terror that went deeper than just fear of the law. It was the terror of a hunted animal. Mary Jensen was a hard woman, forged by blizzards and droughts, but she was not without a heart. She saw the bruises on Nora's soul as clearly as she saw the sketch on the paper. Mary sighed, a long, rattling sound. She reached out and took the poster back, folding it until the face was hidden. "I believe you are in trouble," Mary said, "and I believe you are not a killer by nature. But this is big trouble. Nora, this is the kind of trouble that burns a ranch down." She stood up, tucking the paper into her apron pocket. "I will keep your secret for now, but you have to tell Eli." Nora froze. "No, please, Mary. He cannot know. He is the one who brought you here," Mary said sharply. "He is the one who vouches for you every day. If the law comes riding down that road, he will be the first one standing in front of you. He deserves to know what he is standing for." Mary turned back to the stove. "You tell him, Nora, or I will." Nora fled the kitchen. She needed air. She needed to think. She found herself walking toward the corrals, her feet moving of their own accord. She had to tell him. Mary was right, but the thought of seeing the warmth in Eli's eyes turn to disgust made her chest ache physically. She found Eli near the tack room, mending a cinch. He looked up as she approached. his face breaking into that slow, easy smile that had become the anchor of her world. "Morning," he said. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Nora stopped a few feet away. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the sun. "Eli," she started, "I need to tell you something. Something about why I'm here." Eli's smile faded. He dropped the cinch and took a step toward her. He looked past her, toward the road, then back at her face. The grimness she had seen in Mary was mirrored now in him, but sharper, more dangerous. "It can wait," he said, his voice low. "No, it cannot," Nora insisted. "I have to tell you before—" "Nora, listen to me," he interrupted. He reached out and gripped her upper arms. His grip was tight, urgent. "I was over at the Miller place this morning, helping with a sick bull. A man rode through, a stranger. He was asking questions." Nora went still. "What kind of man?" "A Pinkerton." Eli said the word was a curse. He was flashing a badge and a description. He said he is looking for a woman who ran off from her husband back east. Said the husband is worried sick about her. Said she is unstable." Nora felt the blood leave her head. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Eli hadn't been holding her. "He is alive?" she whispered. The world tilted on its axis. Richard was alive. She wasn't a widow. She was a runaway wife. Eli's eyes narrowed. "Who is alive? Nora? The husband?" "He is here." Nora gasped. The air felt too thin to breathe. "If the Pinkerton is here, Richard is here. He sent him. He is coming for me." Eli pulled her closer, his body becoming a shield between her and the horizon. "Nobody's taking you anywhere," he said, his voice a low growl. "But you need to go back to the house. Stay inside. Stay away from the windows." He released her and turned toward the barn, his stride long and angry. "Where are you going?" Nora cried. "To town," Eli called back. "I need to see just what kind of snake we are dealing with." The town of Bitter Creek was not large, but it had a long memory and a loose tongue. By the time Eli pushed through the swinging doors of the saloon, the story was already 3 drinks deep. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of stale beer. A group of men stood at the bar, laughing. One of them, a drifter named Tate, was holding a copy of the wanted poster, $500. Tate whistled. "That is a lot of money for a slip of a girl. Must be quite a woman to kill a man." Another laughed. Maybe she loved him to death. Tate leered at the drawing. "I reckon I would not mind finding out. A woman with that much fire. Bet she is wild in the sheets. You bring her in. Maybe you get to sample the goods before you hand her over." The men roared with laughter. Eli moved so fast he was a blur. He grabbed Tate by the collar and slammed him backward against the bar. Bottles rattled and a glass shattered on the floor. The room went dead silent. "You shut your mouth," Eli hissed. His face was inches from Tate's, his eyes black with fury. Tate's hands flew up. "Empty." "Whoa, Carter, take it easy. It is just talk." Eli's hand was a vice on the man's shirt. His other hand hovered over the knife at his belt. The rage in him was a living thing, a red haze that wanted to tear this room apart. He wanted to beat the words back down their throats. But he knew, with a sickening clarity, that if he started a fight now, if he drew blood over her name, he would only be painting a target on her back. He would be confirming every rumor. He shoved Tate away with disgust. The man stumbled and fell. Eli scanned the room. His gaze dared anyone to speak. The men looked away, shuffling their feet. He turned and walked out, his boots loud on the floorboards. He felt dirty. He felt the hate in the town like a physical weight. They didn't know her. They didn't know the way she hummed when she cooked, or the way she bandaged a horse's leg with hands that shook but never stopped. They only saw the scandal. He rode back to the ranch at a gallop, the wind cooling the sweat on his neck but doing nothing for the fire in his gut. He found her in the bunkhouse. He had moved out to the loft in the barn weeks ago, giving her this small room for privacy and safety. She was sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Eli closed the door and latched it. He turned to her. "They're talking. Nora," he said. His voice was rough. The poster is everywhere. Nora looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. I know. Mary showed me. Eli took off his hat and threw it on the table. He paced the small room. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. I need the truth. Nora, all of it. Not the story you told Mary, not the story you told me in the cabin. I need to know what I'm fighting. Nora took a shuddering breath. She looked at this man, this hard, scarred man who had given her everything without asking for a thing in return. He deserved the truth, even if it made him hate her. Richard, my husband, he was not just cruel, she began. Her voice was hollow. He was a monster. He liked pain. He liked to see fear. She wrapped her arms around her ribs. He used to beat me in the parlor. He would drag me to the window and press my face against the glass while he hit me. He wanted the neighbors to see. He wanted them to know that I was his property. And they did see. And they did nothing. Because he was rich. Because he was a pillar of the community. Eli stopped pacing. He stood frozen, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. The night I ran, Richard had a business partner, a man named Clancy. They were drinking, Richard told Clancy. He told him he could have me, like I was a horse or a bottle of wine. Nora's voice cracked. A tear slipped down her cheek. Clancy cornered me in the library. He was drunk. He tried to force me. I grabbed a letter opener from the desk. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. I struck him. He fell. He hit his head on the hearth. She looked at her hands, seeing the blood that wasn't there. Richard laughed. He stood in the doorway and laughed. He said, "Now you have done it. Nora, now you are a murderess." He called the police. He told them I had gone mad and attacked his friend. I ran out the back door into the snow. I didn't stop running until you found me. The silence in the room was absolute. Nora waited for the judgment. She waited for him to tell her she was damaged goods, that she was trouble he couldn't afford. Slowly, Eli turned. His face was not filled with disgust. It was a mask of sorrow and a fury so deep it looked like pain. He crossed the room in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees in front of her. He took her face in his large, rough hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were falling now in a steady stream. "You did not murder anyone," he said fiercely. "You survived. You hear me? You survived." He looked into her eyes, willing her to believe him. Any man who would do that, who would let another man... His voice broke. He couldn't finish the sentence. The horror of what she had endured, the image of her face pressed against glass while people watched, tore him apart. "I won't let them take you," he vowed. "I will burn this whole territory down before I let him touch you again." The dam broke. Nora let out a sob that was half wail, half laugh. She threw herself forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Eli caught her. He pulled her off the cot and into his lap, holding her as if he was trying to merge their bodies into one. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of flower and terror and woman. He kissed her then. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, starving thing. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation. He kissed her like he was afraid she would vanish if he stopped. Nora met him with equal force. All the months of fear, all the nights she had lain awake wanting him, poured out of her. She gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, opening to him. She wanted to be consumed. She wanted to forget the poster and the husband and the law. She wanted only this, the heat of him, the strength of his arms, the reality of his mouth on hers. They fell back onto the cot, a tangle of limbs and frantic hands. Eli's hand swept down her back, pressing her hips against his. Nora gasped, arching into him. For a moment, they were on the precipice. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the fire in the small room. Then, Eli froze. He pulled back, his chest heaving. His forehead rested against hers. His eyes were squeezed shut. His hands were gripping her waist so hard it bruised. But he was not moving. "No," he gasped. "Not like this." Nora blinked, dazed. "Eli?" He opened his eyes. They were black with desire, but there was fear there too. "If I take you now, if we do this, and they drag you into court, they will use it. They will say you are loose. They will say I am just another man you seduced to hide your crimes. He smoothed the hair back from her forehead, his touch trembling. I want you, Nora, God, I want you more than my next breath. But I have to protect you, even from me. Nora looked at him. She saw the cost of his restraint. She saw how much he loved her, enough to deny himself, enough to think of her honor when she had forgotten it entirely. She reached up and touched his cheek. Her heart felt like it was expanding, filling her chest until it hurt. You are a good man. Eli Carter, she whispered. He closed his eyes and turned his face into her palm, kissing the center of her hand. We are going to fight this, he said. Together. But the fight came to them before the sun set. A black carriage rolled into the yard, kicking up dust. It was flanked by two riders, the Pinkerton agent, a man with a bowler hat and a face like a ferret, and the sheriff. Inside the carriage sat a man in a pristine gray suit. He stepped out, adjusting his cuffs. He was handsome in a polished, Eastern way. His hair was slicked back, his smile practiced. Nora, watching from the window, felt her blood turn to ice. Richard. He looked exactly as she remembered. Calm, possessed, the master of his domain. Eli stepped off the porch. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his stance wide. He didn't say a word. Richard Hale walked toward the house, ignoring Eli completely. He looked up at the window where Nora stood. Nora, darling, he called out. His voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly in the quiet air. Please come down. We have been so worried. The sound of his voice triggered a physical nausea in her. Eli stepped into his path. That is close enough. Richard stopped. He looked at Eli as if he were a fence post. Excuse me, my good man. I am here for my wife. She is unwell. She has had a episode. We need to get her to a hospital. He is lying. Nora burst out onto the porch. She couldn't hide. Hiding made her look guilty. She stood by the railing, shaking, but her head was high. I am not unwell, Richard, and I am not going anywhere with you. Richard's face softened into a mask of pity. See, he said to the sheriff, the paranoia, the delusions. She thinks I am her enemy. Nora, my love, you killed poor Clancy. You are not yourself. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. He was a local man, elected by the town. He knew Eli, but he also knew the law, and he knew the weight of the gold coin the Pinkerton agent had dropped on his desk. Eli, the sheriff said, we have got a warrant here, validated by the territorial judge. It says she has to go back to Boston to stand trial. She is not going back to Boston. Eli said. His voice was like grinding stone. If there is a charge, she answers it here. In a territorial court, that is the law. The Pinkerton agent stepped forward. This is a federal matter, fugitive from justice. I don't care if it is the president himself. Eli spat. You are not putting her in that carriage, not while I am breathing. He let his hand drop near his gun. It was a subtle move, but everyone saw it. Richard sighed, looking at the gathering crowd of ranch hands and curious townsfolk who had followed the carriage. It breaks my heart, he said loudly, to see her like this, living in squalor, consorting with rough men. I only want to help her. The murmur of the crowd was low and ugly. The church elders, men who valued property and order above all else, nodded. A wife belonged to her husband. A killer belonged in jail. She looks wild, one of them whispered. Look at her hair. Eli heard it. He looked at the sheriff. You take her now, sheriff, and you will have to go through me, and Mr. Jensen, and every boy on this ranch. The sheriff looked at the grim faces of the cowboys behind Eli. He looked at the Pinkerton. We will hold a hearing, the sheriff said, tomorrow morning, in the church. We will sort out the jurisdiction then. Richard smiled, a cold, victorious smile. Very well. One more night won't matter. She will come to her senses. He tipped his hat to Nora. Sleep well, darling. They left, the carriage stirring up a cloud of dust that tasted of ash. That night, the ranch was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. Nora sat in the bunkhouse. Eli was outside, keeping watch, pacing the perimeter with a rifle in the crook of his arm. She watched him through the window. She saw the exhaustion in the slope of his shoulders. She thought about the hearing tomorrow. Richard had money. He had lawyers. He had the town's prejudice on his side. Eli would fight. He would fight until he was dead. And that was exactly what would happen. Richard would goad him, or the Pinkerton would shoot him, or the law would hang him for interfering. She looked at her hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors and mended fences, the hands Eli had kissed. She loved him. She loved him with a fierce, terrifying clarity. And because she loved him, she could not let him be destroyed for her. She found a scrap of paper and a pencil stub. Eli, you are the only good thing that has ever happened to me. You showed me that I am not broken, but I cannot let you bleed for my mistakes. You deserve a life that is whole and safe. You deserve better than a woman who brings the storm with her. Do not follow me. Please, if you love me, let me run, Nora. She folded the note and placed it on the pillow of the cot. She packed only what she could carry: a canteen, a loaf of bread, her shawl. She slipped out the back window. The wind was biting, carrying the scent of snow from the peaks. The plains stretched out before her, vast and black and indifferent. She knew the emptiness of them now. She knew the cold, but she also knew the warmth she was leaving behind. She crept past the barn, avoiding the patch of moonlight where Eli stood guard. She swallowed the sob that threatened to choke her. She walked into the dark, one foot in front of the other, walking away from the only home she had ever known to save the man who had given it to her. Eli found the room empty just as the sky began to gray. He saw the open window. He saw the note on the pillow. He read it once, then he crumpled it in his fist. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. The feeling inside him was too big for sound. It was a white-hot clarity. She thought she was saving him. She thought she was a burden. She was wrong. He walked to the barn. He saddled his horse, his movements precise and deadly. He checked his rifle. He checked his cinch. He swung into the saddle just as the sun broke the horizon. It was a blood-red dawn, painting the sagebrush in crimson light. He turned his horse toward the open plains. Toward the tracks he could already see leading away from the house. Run all you want. Nora, he whispered to the wind. I will chase you to the ocean if I have to. He spurred the horse, and they thundered out of the yard, riding into the bleeding sun. The mud of the Wyoming spring was not merely wet earth. It was a living, malevolent thing that sought to swallow a horse to the fetlock and suck the boots right off a man's feet. Eli Carter rode through it with his hat pulled low against a stinging drizzle, his eyes scanning the horizon until they burned. He had been in the saddle for 3 days, sleeping in snatching intervals of 2 hours, eating jerky without tasting it. The tracks he followed were faint, washed out by the melting snow and the relentless rain. But he knew what he was looking for. He looked for the faltering stride of a horse that was being ridden too hard by a rider who did not know how to pace it. He looked for the small, broken branches of sagebrush where a novice traveler had cut too close. He stopped at a homestead that was little more than a dugout cut into the side of a hill, smoke curling from a stovepipe that poked through the sod. The homesteader, a man with a face like a dried walnut, leaned on a hoe and eyed Eli with the suspicion that was the currency of the territory. I saw a rider, the man admitted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. Yesterday, near sundown. Small thing, wrapped in a shawl. Horse looked winded. Did she say anything? Eli asked. The water dripped from the brim of his hat, running down his nose. Asked for water, the man said. I gave her a biscuit. She looked like she was running from the devil himself. Kept looking over her shoulder. Eli felt a muscle jump in his jaw. She was scared. She was out here in the emptiness, thinking she was saving him, and the thought twisted in his gut like a knife. Which way? The man pointed a gnarled finger toward the jagged spine of the foothills to the northwest, toward the broken rock country. Bad place for a lone woman, bad place for anyone. Eli nodded his thanks and spurred his horse. The big gelding groaned but surged forward. Sensing the urgency in the rider's hands, The worry that had been gnawing at Eli since he found the empty bed had now become a roaring panic. The broken rock was a maze of canyons and blind drops, a place where outlaws and drifters hid when they did not want to be found. 30 miles ahead, Nora Hale was learning the true meaning of silence. She had camped in the dry bed of a creek, hoping the high banks would shelter her from the wind. It was a mistake. The cold air settled in the low ground, heavy and damp. She sat huddled near a pitiful fire made of sagebrush twigs that burned hot and fast and gave no real warmth. She held a piece of hardtack in her hand, staring at the flames. Her stomach rumbled, a hollow ache, but she had no appetite. Every shadow that stretched across the sand looked like a man. Every snap of a twig sounded like a boot step. She closed her eyes and saw the line cabin. She felt the phantom weight of the blankets Eli had tucked around her. She remembered the rough calluses of his palm against her cheek, the way his voice dropped an octave when he told her she was safe. "You fool," she whispered to the darkness. "You foolish, stupid woman." She had left to protect him, but out here, shivering in the vast indifference of the plains, the nobility of her sacrifice felt thin. She missed him. She missed him with a physical intensity that frightened her more than the cold. She realized that she had not just left a safe harbor. She had walked away from the other half of herself. She slept fitfully, waking with a gasp as the sun began to bleed over the canyon rim. She saddled her horse with stiff, clumsy fingers. The animal was skittish, tossing its head. Nora mounted, her legs sore, and rode out of the creek bed, seeking a way through the labyrinth of stone. It was mid-morning when the bad luck caught her. She was guiding her horse through a narrow cut between two towering boulders when she heard the whistle. It was a sharp, human sound that cut through the wind. She pulled on the reins, her heart hammering. 3 men emerged from the scrub oak ahead. They were hard men, dressed in mismatched wool and leather, their faces obscured by beard growth and grime. They were drifters, the kind of men who moved from town to town, looking for loose work or loose change, and taking whatever wasn't nailed down. One of them, a heavy-set man wearing a faded Union forage cap, stepped forward. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Well now," he said, his voice greasy with mock politeness. "Look what we have here, boys." Nora turned her horse, intending to bolt back the way she came, but a second man had already circled behind her, blocking the path. He grinned, revealing a gap where his front teeth should have been. "Do not be in such a rush, darling," the second man said. "We were just discussing you." The man with the cap unfolded the paper. It was the poster. He looked at the sketch, then up at Nora. $500. He mused. "That is a lot of whiskey." Nora's hand went to the pommel of her saddle. "Let me pass," she said. Her voice shook, betraying her. The third man, younger and rangier, laughed. He stepped closer. Grabbing her horse's bridle, the animal pinned its ears, but the man held firm. "Pass," he sneered. "I do not think so. The law wants you, little lady. Says you are a killer." He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her bodice, then her legs. "Though I reckon we do not have to be in a hurry to turn you in. A woman like you. Maybe you can work off some of that reward money before we take you to the sheriff." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the same look she had seen in Clancy's eyes in the library. It was the same look Richard gave her when he closed the parlor drapes. Nora backed her horse up, but she was boxed in against the canyon wall. "Stay back!" she screamed. The man in the cap laughed. He tucked the poster into his coat and drew a long knife from his belt. "Get her down, boys, and try not to bruise her face. We want the full price." The man holding the bridle yanked hard. Nora screamed as the horse reared. She clung to the saddle horn, the world spinning. Then, the gunshot cracked the air like a whip. The man holding the bridle screamed and let go. Clutching his forearm where a bloom of red suddenly appeared. Nora's horse bolted sideways, slamming into the rock wall. Eli came thundering out of the brush on the ridge above them. He did not look like a man. He looked like judgment carved from granite. He worked the lever of his Winchester with a mechanical fury, not pausing to aim, just pouring lead into the canyon floor to suppress them. "Get down!" he roared at Nora. The drifters scrambled for cover behind the boulders. The man with the cap pulled a revolver and fired blindly up at the ridge. Eli's horse danced on the loose scree. He dropped the reins, guiding with his knees, firing again. Dust geysered up near the leader's boots. Nora slid from her saddle, scrambling on her hands and knees toward a depression in the rocks. The air was filled with the whine of ricochets and the smell of sulfur. One of the drifters popped up and took aim at Nora. Eli saw it. He didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse off the ridge, sliding down the steep embankment in a shower of gravel. He put himself between the shooter and Nora. A shot rang out. Eli jerked in the saddle, his body twisting violently. "Eli!" Nora screamed. He didn't fall. He righted himself, gritted his teeth, and fired his rifle one-handed. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to send the drifter scrambling back into the brush. "You want some more?" Eli bellowed, his voice raw. "Come on. I've got a bullet for every one of you." The ferocity of the assault broke them. They were bullies, not warriors, facing a madman on a sliding horse who seemed willing to die to kill them. They chose survival. They scrambled for their own mounts, hidden in the scrub, and tore off down the canyon, leaving a trail of dust. Silence slammed back into the canyon, ringing in Nora's ears. She scrambled up from the dirt. Eli, he was sitting slumped in the saddle, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Blood was soaking the sleeve of his blue shirt, turning the fabric black. He was breathing in ragged gasps. He looked at her. His eyes were wild, dilated with adrenaline and terror. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "Did they touch you?" Nora ran to his horse. "No, I am fine. Eli, your shoulder. I told you not to run," he shouted. The anger in his voice stopped her cold. He wasn't comforting her. He was furious. "I told you to stay put," he yelled, swinging his good leg over the saddle and dropping to the ground. He stumbled, catching himself on the horse's flank. "You could have been killed. Do you have any idea what they would have done to you?" Nora's own fear ignited into anger. She shoved him, her hands hitting his chest. "I left to save you," she screamed back. "They were coming for you. Eli, I couldn't let them take everything you have. I don't care about the ranch." Eli roared. He winced, clutching his shoulder, but he didn't back down. "I don't care about the cattle. I care about you. What good is a safe life if you are dead in a ditch somewhere? I am not your responsibility." Nora cried, tears streaming down her dusty face. "I am a wanted woman. I am poison. Eli, you are my life," he shouted. The words hung between them, echoing off the canyon walls. Eli swayed. His face went gray beneath the tan. The adrenaline was fading, leaving the shock of the wound to take hold. He took a step toward her, his eyes searching hers, and then his knees buckled. "Eli!" Nora caught him before he hit the ground. She wasn't strong enough to hold his full weight, but she eased him down against a flat rock. Panic washed away her anger instantly. She looked at the blood spreading across his chest. It was too much blood. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice shaking but her hands moving with purpose. She reached for the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers were slick with his blood. She couldn't get them undone fast enough. She grabbed the fabric and ripped it, tearing the shirt open. The wound was ugly. A furrow dug across the top of his shoulder muscle. It was deep, but it hadn't hit the bone or the lung. Nora stripped off her shawl and tore a strip from her petticoat. She grabbed her canteen. "This is going to hurt," she warned. Eli grunted, his eyes squeezed shut. "Do it." She poured the water over the wound to clean the grit. Eli hissed through his teeth, his back arching off the rock. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, squeezing until it hurt, anchoring himself to her. "I am sorry," Nora whispered, weeping now. "I am so sorry." She pressed the pad of cloth against the wound. The intimacy of it hit her suddenly. She was touching his bare skin, his chest rising and falling rapidly under her hand. She saw the other scars there, white lines on his ribs, a burn mark on his forearm. It was a map of pain that he carried. She leaned over him, using her weight to keep the pressure. Her hair fell forward, brushing his cheek. Eli opened his eyes. They were hazy with pain, but they fixed on her face. "You are here," he whispered. "You are safe, you foolish man," she sobbed softly. "You came for me. I will always come for you." The sky, which had been threatening all morning, finally broke. Thunder rolled down the canyon like a rock slide. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the dry stone, turning the dust to mud instantly. "We need shelter," Eli rasped. Nora helped him stand. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulders. They left the horses tied in a mesquite grove and stumbled toward a shallow cave Nora had spotted near the canyon floor. Inside, it was dry and smelled of old earth and animals. Nora helped Eli sit against the wall. She gathered dry brush from the entrance and managed to start a small fire. The light danced on the cave walls, pushing back the gloom of the storm. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, a gray curtain that sealed them in. Nora sat beside Eli, checking the bandage. The bleeding had slowed. She pulled his coat back over his shoulders to keep him warm. She sat close to him, shivering now that the danger was past. Eli reached out with his good arm and pulled her to him. She didn't resist. She curled into his side, resting her head on his good shoulder, his arm wrapped around her, holding her tight against his ribs. They fit together. It was not a clumsy, new thing. It felt like coming home. Nora ran her finger lightly over a jagged white scar that ran down his bicep. "Where did this one come from?" she asked softly. Eli looked down at the mark. "Barbed wire." He said, "First year I was a drover. Horse spooked and threw me into a fence." She traced another, a small circular mark near his collarbone. "And this? Cigar burn," he said. Nora stiffened. She looked up at his face. Eli stared into the fire. "My father," he said quietly. "He was a mean drunk, liked to teach lessons, said pain was the only thing a boy remembered." He took a breath, his chest rising against her cheek. "I was 12. I dropped a bottle of his whiskey. He put his cigar out on me, said it would remind me to be careful." Nora's heart broke for the boy he had been. She thought of her own scars, the ones Richard had left on her soul. "He told me I was worthless," Eli said, "that I would never be anything but a drifter and a bum. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was not him. I swore I would never use my hands to hurt anyone who didn't have it coming." He turned his head, looking down at her. His eyes were vulnerable, stripped of the cowboy stoicism. "That is why I was so scared. Nora, when you left, I thought maybe I was not enough. I thought maybe you saw the broken parts of me and decided you deserved better." Nora sat up. She turned to face him, ignoring the cramped space. She placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look at her. "Eli Carter, look at me." She waited until his eyes locked on hers. "I didn't run because you weren't enough. I ran because I wanted to be worthy of you. You are the finest man I have ever known." Richard, he had polished manners and expensive suits, and he was a devil. You have scars and dirt on your boots, and you are the only holy thing in my life." Eli's breath hitched. He reached up and covered her hands with his own. "Nora," he whispered. The air in the cave changed. The relief and the fear evaporated, leaving something heavier, hotter. He leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss in the bunkhouse, desperate and frantic. This was slow. It was a question asked in the slide of his lips against hers. Nora answered it. She opened her mouth, tasting him. She moved her hands to his neck, tangling her fingers in his hair. He groaned low in his throat. He pulled her closer, shifting so she was straddling his lap, mindful of his shoulder but needing her close. Nora felt the heat of him through her clothes. She felt the evidence of his desire. For the first time in her life, the fear didn't come. There was no ghost of Richard in the shadows. There was only Eli. She pulled back slightly, breathing hard. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Your shoulder—" "I am fine," he murmured, his lips brushing her jawline. "I have never been better." He began to unbutton her bodice. His fingers were shaking slightly, not from weakness, but from reverence. He touched her skin as if it were silk, as if she were something breakable and precious. Nora helped him. They shed the layers of wool and cotton, the barriers of the world. When skin touched skin, a shock went through her. He laid her back on the blankets. He moved over her, supporting his weight on his good arm. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing every curve, every shadow. "You are beautiful." "Nora," he said. She reached up and touched his chest. "Make me forget," she whispered. "Make me forget everything but this." He kissed her deeply, and then they moved together. It was careful. It was slow. Eli watched her face every second, checking for any sign of fear. When she tensed, he stopped, waiting, soothing her with whispers until she relaxed again. "I am here," he said. "Just me, just us." Nora felt the old trauma begin to recede. It was pushed back by the overwhelming reality of his tenderness. This was not taking. This was giving. He was giving her his strength, his vulnerability, his heart, and she was giving him hers. When the release came, it was not a violent explosion, but a warm, golden tide that washed over them both. Nora cried out, clutching his shoulders, burying her face in his neck. Eli held her through it, shuddering with his own completion. Whispering her name like a prayer, they lay tangled together as the storm passed. The cave grew quiet, save for the drip of water from the entrance. Nora lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady thrum of his heart. She felt his arm around her, heavy and protective. She realized, with a clarity that was sharp as glass, that she could never run again. Running meant leaving this, and leaving this was a kind of death she could not survive. She traced the line of his jaw. "Eli? He rumbled, half asleep. "We cannot keep running," she said. He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling of the cave. "No, we can't. If we run, he will chase us forever," she said. "He will send men. He will send the law. We will spend our lives looking over our shoulders." Eli tightened his arm around her. "So what do? We go back," Nora said. "But not to the ranch. Not yet." She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Her voice was stronger now, the steel returning to her spine. "Richard is lying. He lied about the murder. He lied about his business. But he has the judges in his pocket," Eli reminded her. "In Boston?" "Yes," Nora said. "But this is the territory, and Richard has enemies." She looked at Eli. "There was a housemaid, Sarah. She saw him beat me. She cleaned up the blood more than once. And there was a newspaperman, a Mr. O'Connell. He hated Richard. He was investigating Richard's company for fraud before I left." She grabbed Eli's hand. "If we can get to them, if we can get a statement." "We need a telegraph," Eli said, sitting up. "And not the one in Bitter Creek. The operator there drinks with the sheriff." "We have to go to Laramie," Nora said. "It is a rail town. It is big enough that Richard won't control it." "Laramie is 4 days' ride," Eli said, "through the high passes, and there is still snow up there." "I don't care," Nora said. "I am not running away anymore. Eli, I am running towards something." Eli looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her chin. He smiled, a tired, proud smile. "All right then," he said. "To Laramie." The journey to Laramie was a crucible. They left the next morning, the sky scoured clean and blue. Eli's shoulder was stiff and painful, forcing him to ride with his arm in a sling, but he never complained. They rode through country that God seemed to have made in a fit of anger. They crossed alkali flats where the dust burned their throats and cracked their lips until they bled. They navigated narrow slot canyons where the walls pressed in so tight the sky became a sliver. On the third day, as they climbed into the high passes, the weather turned. A spring squall hit them, dumping heavy, wet snow. The wind cut through their coats like razors. They had to lead the horses, trudging through knee-deep drifts. Nora's feet went numb. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the snow. "I can't," she gasped. "Eli, I can't take another step." Eli was there instantly. He dropped to his knees beside her. He took her frozen hands and tucked them into his coat, against the warmth of his body. "Look at me," he said. His face was gray with cold, his beard crusted with ice, but his eyes were fierce. "We are not dying on this mountain. Nora, you hear me? We are going to walk into that town. We are going to send those telegrams. And then we are going to go home." He pulled her up. He didn't have the strength to carry her, and she knew it. So he did the next best thing. He tied a rope from his belt to hers. "Lean on me," he said. They walked in lockstep. When she faltered, the rope went taut, and his strength pulled her forward. When he stumbled, weakened by his wound, she was there to steady him. They spoke to each other through the wind. They told stories. He told her about the names of the stars. She told him about the books she used to read in the secret quiet of the library. They built a world with words to keep the cold at bay. When they finally crested the pass and saw the lights of Laramie twinkling in the valley below, it was midnight. They were exhausted, frozen, and battered. But as they stood there, looking down at the promise of the town, Nora reached out and took Eli's hand. "We made it," she whispered. Eli squeezed her fingers. "We are just getting started," he said. They began the descent, leaving the bloody tracks of their struggle in the snow behind them, walking toward the fight that would decide their future. Laramie was a beast of smoke and iron, a stark contrast to the silence of the high passes. The air tasted of coal dust and unwashed bodies, and the ground vibrated with the heavy, rhythmic chugging of the locomotives that connected the territory to the civilized East. To Nora, the noise was overwhelming, a chaotic assault on senses that had grown accustomed to the wind in the sagebrush. They found a lawyer on the second floor of a building that smelled of stale beer from the saloon below. Mr. Silas Reed was a man whose suit had seen better decades, and whose eyes held the cynical weariness of someone who had seen every variety of human folly. He listened to their story, his fingers steepled, looking from Eli's sling to Nora's desperate, wind-burned face. He did not ask for money up front, which was the first sign that luck might finally be turning. "I know the firm representing your husband," Reed said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "They are sharks, but sharks have a habit of eating their own when the water gets bloody. If what you say is true, Mrs. Hale, we need paper. The law loves paper." The telegraph office was next. The operator was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a sympathetic gaze that lingered on the bruising around Nora's eyes. He took the messages she had written out, one to Sarah, the housemaid who had silently handed her ice packs after Richard's rages, and one to Mr. O'Connell, the newspaperman who had once whispered to her at a gala that her husband was a man built on sand. The operator slid the form toward her for a signature. Nora picked up the pen. Her hand hovered over the paper. For months, she had been Nora Lee. She had been a ghost. To sign her true name was to summon the demon she had run from. It was an admission of existence. She felt Eli's hand on her back, warm and steady. "You are not that name anymore," he murmured. "It is just ink." She took a breath and wrote, the letters shaky but legible. Nora Hale. The wait was an agony measured in hours. They took a room in a boarding house near the tracks. Eli sat by the window, cleaning his gun with his good hand, his eyes scanning the street below. Nora paced, her skirt swishing on the rough floorboards. To distract herself, she picked up a discarded newspaper from the bedside table. It was a Boston daily, 3 weeks old. She scanned the columns, and her breath hitched. There, on page 4, was a headline, "Prominent businessman Richard Hale established fund for missing wife." The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It described Richard as a devastated saint, searching tirelessly for his troubled and mentally fragile wife, who had vanished after a tragic accident involving his business partner. It spoke of his devotion, his sleepless nights, his cooperation with the authorities to bring her home safely to the asylum where she could get the help she needed. Nora read it aloud, her voice trembling with nausea. "He has twisted it all," she whispered, dropping the paper as if it were burning. "He has made himself the hero." Eli picked up the paper and threw it into the cold stove. "Ink and lies," he said. "That is all it is. We're going to write a new ending." The replies came 2 days later. Sarah's response was brief and terrified, but clear. She would swear to the abuse, to the threats, to the blood she had cleaned from the parlor rug. She would send a sworn affidavit to the sheriff in Bitter Creek, provided her name was kept out of the papers. She feared Richard's reach. Mr. O'Connell was more aggressive. His telegram was lengthy, costing nearly $10 to receive. He had been digging. Richard's business partner, the man Nora had struck, had been embezzling funds with Richard's knowledge. The murder was convenient for Richard. It removed a partner who knew too much and a wife who was becoming a liability. O'Connell was sending copies of ledgers and letters via the express train. They would not arrive for a week, but the summary in the telegram was damning. "It is motive," Reed the lawyer said, reading the telegrams with a gleam in his eye. "It proves he had a reason to lie. It proves he had a reason to frame you. It does not clear you of the strike that killed the man, but it destroys the narrative of the innocent husband." "It is enough," Eli said, standing up. They rode out the next morning. The return journey was not a flight. It was a campaign. They did not ride straight to the ranch. Instead, they stopped at the isolated homesteads scattered across the plains, the sod houses and rough shacks where women lived lives of quiet, brutal endurance. Nora spoke to them. She did not hide her face. She sat in their kitchens, drinking weak coffee, and she told them the truth. She told Mrs. Galloway, whose husband had a temper when the whiskey took him. She told the widow Miller, who ran her spread alone with a shotgun by the door. "I am going back to face him," Nora told them, her voice steady. "He says a wife is property. He says a woman has no right to defend her own body. I say he is wrong." She showed them the scars on her soul, and in their eyes, she saw recognition. They knew the silence of a house where a man's anger ruled. They knew the fear of being smaller, weaker, trapped by law and custom. "We will be there," Mrs. Galloway said, wiping her hands on her apron. "When the time comes, we will be there." By the time they reached Bitter Creek, a small army of sentiment was marching behind them. Invisible but heavy. The town was tense. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Richard Hale was holding court in the hotel, playing the grieving victim to perfection. The Pinkerton agent stood at his side, a dark shadow of federal authority. When Eli and Nora rode down the main street, heads turned, conversations stopped. They did not look like fugitives. They looked like people who had walked through hell and come out the other side carrying fire. They went straight to the sheriff's office. The lawman looked tired, caught between the pressure of Richard's money and the surly mood of the locals who didn't like Easterners telling them what to do. "I have scheduled a hearing," the sheriff said, not meeting Eli's eyes. "Tomorrow morning. In the church. It is the only building big enough to hold the crowd." "In the church?" Eli scoffed. "Since when is justice a sermon? Since the town is divided down the middle." "Carter," the sheriff snapped. "And I want witnesses. I want everyone to see whatever happens, so nobody can say I rigged it." The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear. The church bell tolled, a mournful sound that echoed off the false fronts of the stores. Nora dressed in her best clothes, a simple gray dress Mary Jensen had altered for her. It was plain, almost severe, but she wore it like armor. She pinned her hair back, revealing her face. She would not hide. Not today. She walked through the town on Eli's arm. He wore a clean shirt, his sling gone, though his shoulder was still stiff. He walked with a slow, rolling gait, his eyes scanning the rooftops, his hand never straying far from his hip. The gauntlet was brutal. As they passed the mercantile, a man spat on the ground near Nora's hem. "Shameless," he muttered. "Bringing your filth here." Nora did not flinch. She kept her eyes forward. But then, she saw them. Standing near the livery was the blacksmith's wife. She nodded to Nora, a sharp, decisive dip of her chin. Further down, outside the saloon, Pearl the dance hall girl was waiting. She wasn't wearing her usual bright feathers. She was dressed in somber black. As Nora passed, Pearl stepped off the boardwalk and fell into step 10 paces behind them. Then Mary Jensen joined from the side street. Then Mrs. Galloway, who had ridden 10 miles that morning. By the time they reached the white-clapboard church, Nora was not just walking with Eli. She was walking with a phalanx of women who had decided that Nora's fight was their fight. The church was packed. The air was hot and smelled of wool and beeswax. Richard sat in the front pew on the left, looking immaculate and sorrowful. The Pinkerton agent sat beside him, a briefcase of documents on his lap. Nora and Eli took the pew on the right. The aisle between them felt like a canyon. The sheriff stood at the pulpit, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. He banged a gavel on the lectern. "This is a preliminary hearing," he announced, "to determine if there is sufficient cause to extradite Mrs. Nora Hale to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to stand trial for the murder of Patrick Clancy." The Pinkerton agent rose first. He was smooth, professional. He laid out the warrant. He spoke of the sanctity of the law, of the brutal crime committed against a defenseless man, of Nora's flight which proved her guilt. "She is a hysteric," the agent said, adjusting his spectacles. "A woman prone to delusions. Her husband has spent a fortune trying to find her, to help her, and she repays him by running off with a drifter and dragging his good name through the mud." Richard took the stand next. He dabbed at his eyes with a silk handkerchief. "I loved her," he said, his voice breaking perfectly. "I gave her everything, a home, status. But she was never happy. She imagined slights. She imagined cruelty. Poor Clancy was just trying to calm her down that night. It was an accident, surely, but she must come home. She needs care." The town elders nodded. It was a compelling story. A tragic husband, a mad wife. It made sense to them. It fit the world they understood. Then, it was Nora's turn. She stood up. Her legs felt like water, but Eli's hand squeezed hers hard before he let go. "You survived," he had told her. "Tell them." She walked to the front of the church. She turned to face the room. She did not look at the sheriff. She looked at the people. She looked at the women. "My husband says I am mad," Nora began. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the dead silence. "He says I imagine the cruelty." She pulled up the sleeve of her dress. She unbuttoned the cuff and rolled it back, revealing a jagged silver scar that ran up her forearm, a souvenir from a broken wine bottle 2 years ago. "Did I imagine this?" she asked. She pointed to a small scar above her eyebrow. "Or this?" Richard stiffened in his pew. "He hit me because the soup was cold," Nora said. "He hit me because I smiled at the grocer. He hit me because he liked the sound it made." A ripple of unease went through the men in the room. The women sat stone still. "He says I murdered Patrick Clancy." Nora looked directly at Richard then. "Patrick Clancy cornered me in the library while my husband stood in the doorway and watched. Patrick Clancy tore my dress. He told me I was payment for a debt my husband owed him." Gasps broke out in the room. Richard's face turned a mottled red. "Liar!" Richard shouted, half rising. "She is lying. Sit down. Mr. Hale!" the sheriff barked. "I grabbed a letter opener." Nora continued, her voice gaining strength. "I struck him to stop him. I struck him because I wanted to live. I did not run because I was guilty of murder. I ran because I knew my husband would see me hanged before he let me speak the truth." Eli stood up then. He walked to the sheriff and handed him the sheaf of papers they had collected in Laramie. "Affidavit from the housemaid. Sarah Miller," Eli said, his voice ringing off the rafters. "Swearing to years of physical abuse, and financial records from the Boston Star, showing that Richard Hale and Patrick Clancy were under investigation for embezzling $50,000. The sheriff took the papers. He read them, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "It says here Clancy was threatening to turn state's evidence," the sheriff muttered into the silence. Nora pointed at Richard. "He didn't want me back because he loves me," she said. "He wanted me back because I am the only witness who knows he stood there and let Clancy die so his secrets would stay buried." The room erupted. The narrative had shattered. The image of the grieving husband dissolved, revealing the cornered rat beneath. Richard Hale looked around. He saw the judgment in the eyes of the town. He saw the disgust on the faces of the women. He saw his control slipping away like water through fingers. The mask fell. "You ungrateful bitch," he screamed. The sound was shocking in the holy space. It was raw, ugly, and violent. "I took you from nothing. I gave you a name. And this is how you repay me, spreading filth? You belong to me." He was not acting now. He was the monster Nora had described. The Pinkerton agent slowly closed his briefcase and took a step away from his client. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. Richard's eyes were wild. He looked at Nora, standing there in her gray dress, untouchable, strong. He looked at Eli, standing between him and her, a wall of defiance. He snapped. He reached into his coat. "He's got a gun!" Someone screamed. Chaos exploded. People dove behind pews. Richard pulled a Derringer, a small, deadly hideout gun. He didn't aim it at Nora. He aimed it at Eli. "If I cannot have her, no one can!" Richard roared. Eli moved. He didn't dive for cover. He lunged forward. The gun cracked. Eli jerked back, a spray of red misting the air, but his momentum carried him. He crashed into Richard, slamming him against the altar railing. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs. The Derringer skittered across the floor. Richard, fueled by a maniacal rage, scrambled for it. He kicked Eli in his wounded shoulder. Eli roared in pain, his grip loosening. Richard grabbed the gun. He rolled onto his back, raising the weapon. He aimed it at Nora, who stood frozen near the pulpit. "Die!" he shrieked. A deafening boom shook the stained glass windows. It wasn't the Derringer. Richard Hale's head snapped back. He collapsed onto the floor, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. Smoke curled from the barrel of the sheriff's Colt revolver. The lawman stood by the lectern, his hand steady, his face grim. Silence, absolute, ringing silence. Nora stared at the body of her husband. He looked smaller in death. The terrifying giant who had shadowed her life was just a heap of expensive wool and bone. "Eli!" She scrambled toward him. Eli was pushing himself up to a sitting position. He was clutching his side, where a dark stain was spreading on his shirt. "I am all right," he wheezed. "Just took a piece of my rib. I think—" Nora fell to her knees beside him. She put her hands on his face, checking his eyes, frantically searching for life. "You idiot," she sobbed. "You wonderful, stupid idiot." Eli managed a weak grin. "Told you. I wouldn't let him take you." The sheriff holstered his gun. He walked over to the body, nudged it with his boot, then looked at the Pinkerton agent. "You saw that," the sheriff said flatly. "I saw a man lose his mind and attempt to murder a witness and a bystander," the Pinkerton said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I saw a justifiable shooting by a peace officer." The sheriff nodded. He looked at Nora, kneeling on the floor of the church in the blood of the man who had tormented her. He picked up the warrant from the lectern. He tore it in half. "Case closed," the sheriff announced. "As far as this territory is concerned, justice has been done." He looked at the crowd. "Show is over. Folks, go home." Nora helped Eli stand. He leaned heavily on her, but he was upright. They walked out of the church. The sun was blindingly bright after the dim interior. The crowd parted for them, not out of fear this time, but out of a stunned respect. Mary Jensen was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She didn't say a word. She just reached out and took Nora's hand, squeezing it hard. It was over, but as the adrenaline faded, Nora felt a strange, hollowing sensation. There was no parade. There was no cheering. The townspeople were whispering, their eyes darting from the blood on Eli's shirt to the dead man being carried out by the undertaker. Some of the families, the ones who had sided with Richard, walked away with stiff backs, refusing to look at her. They hated her not because she was guilty, but because she had forced them to see an ugliness they wanted to ignore. She had disrupted their order. Nora stood on the dusty street, the wind whipping her skirts. She looked at Eli. He was pale, in pain, but he was there. "Is it done?" she asked him. Eli looked at the horizon. where the clouds were gathering over the mountains. "The running is done," he said softly. "Now comes the living, and that is the hard part." Nora looked back at the church. She had won her life, but the cost was painted in blood on the floorboards of the house of God. She realized then that there were no clean victories in this country. There was only survival, and the people you chose to survive with. She put her arm around Eli's waist. "Let's go home," she said. They walked toward the wagon, leaving the town to its whispers and its ghosts. The spring wind in Wyoming was a sculptor. It carved the snow from the high peaks. It chiseled the mud into hard, cracked ruts, and it scoured the faces of the people until they looked like the land itself. For weeks after the shooting in the church, the wind blew relentlessly, as if trying to scrub the memory of violence from the streets of Bitter Creek on the Carter Ranch. The rhythms of life returned with the stubborn persistence of grass pushing through ash. The cattle did not care about murder trials or exonerations. They only cared about the new green shoots appearing on the south slopes. The fences, leaning from the heavy winter snows, demanded uprighting. The water troughs needed scrubbing. Nora Hale worked alongside Eli Carter, her hands no longer trembling, though they were rougher now than they had ever been. She wore a split riding skirt and a man's shirt, her hair braided tight against the dust. They moved together in a silence that was no longer guarded but companionable. When they stretched wire for the new paddock, Eli would pull the tension and Nora would drive the staple, their movements synchronized, a dance of labor that replaced the dance of courtship. The town was slower to heal, the first time Nora rode in for supplies. The silence on the main street was thick enough to choke on. But then, Mrs. Miller stepped off the boardwalk. She was a woman who had once pulled her skirts away from Nora. Now, she walked up to the wagon, holding a jar of preserved spiced apples. "For your pantry," Mrs. Miller said, her face flushing a mottled red. "My husband said, well, he said you folks might need something sweet." She thrust the jar into Nora's hands and hurried away before Nora could say thank you. It was a clumsy peace offering, but it was a start. The blacksmith, who had been one of the first to believe Richard's lies, now tipped his hat when Eli walked by, though he could not quite meet Eli's eyes. The church elders remained cold, passing Nora with stiff necks, their pride unable to digest the fact that they had championed a monster. But their judgment no longer held weight. The women of the town, the ones who knew the shape of a bruise hidden under a sleeve, formed a protective phalanx around Nora. They did not make speeches. They simply included her. They asked her opinion on calico prints. They shared recipes for curing colic. In their quiet inclusion, they stitched her into the quilt of the community. Yet, the nights were still a battleground. The darkness of the bedroom sometimes brought Richard back. Nora would wake up gasping, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The phantom sensation of his hands on her throat so real she clawed at her own skin. In those moments, the reality of the ranch would assert itself in the form of Eli. He never asked what she saw. He never told her it was just a dream. He simply pulled her against him, his arm a heavy, solid weight across her chest. He would press his face into the curve of her neck, his beard scratching softly, grounding her in the physical present. "I have got you," he would rumble, his voice thick with sleep. "The door is locked. The gun is on the table. You are in Wyoming. You are with me." He let her cry if she needed to. He let her shake. He offered himself as the stone against which she could break her waves of panic until the tide went out. As spring deepened into summer, the shadows began to retreat. The evenings on the porch became their sanctuary. They would sit as the sun dipped below the jagged rim of the mountains, painting the sky in violent purples and bruised oranges. Eli would smoke a cigarette, his boots propped on the railing, and Nora would sit on the bench beside him, her fingers idly tracing the veins in his hand. One evening, after a long day of branding, the air was heavy with the scent of sage and singed hair. Nora was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for a pie. Eli came in, washing the grit from his face at the basin. He flicked a handful of water at her, drops landing on her cheek. Nora gasped, feigning outrage. She dipped her hand into the flour canister and slapped a white handprint onto the back of his clean shirt. Eli froze. He turned slowly, a wicked glint in his eye. "You are going to pay for that, Mrs. Hale," he drawled. He lunged for her. Nora shrieked, laughter bubbling up from her chest. A sound so bright and unburdened it surprised them both. She dodged around the table, but he was faster. He caught her by the waist, spinning her around, burying his face in her neck while she shrieked and swatted at him with flour-dusted hands. They collapsed onto the floor, a tangle of limbs and laughter. But as his weight settled over her, the laughter died away, replaced by a sudden, intense heat. Eli looked down at her, his face dusted with white powder, his eyes dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. "You are beautiful," he whispered, "even when you are making a mess of my kitchen." He kissed her then, and it was not the desperate, fearful kissing of the runaways they had been. It was slow. It was thorough. It was an affirmation. Their lovemaking that night was a celebration of survival. It was a reclaiming of the body that had once been treated as property, now given freely and joyfully. When they lay tangled in the sheets afterward, the window opened to the cool night air. Nora felt a peace so profound it frightened her. The past, however, had one final word to say. It arrived in the form of a thick envelope from Boston, carried by the overland mail. Mary Jensen brought it out to the barn where Nora was currying the horses. Mary's face was solemn as she handed it over. Nora saw the return address, O'Connell Associates. Her hands shook as she broke the wax seal. Eli stopped his work and came to stand behind her, his presence a silent fortification. She unfolded the newspaper clippings first. The headlines were bold and damning. The Hale scandal, fraud, abuse, and the fall of a titan. Mr. O'Connell had been thorough. He had published the ledgers. He had published Sarah's affidavit, heavily redacted to protect her identity, but clear in its details. He had interviewed business associates who, sensing blood in the water, had turned on Richard with vicious glee. But it was the official document at the bottom of the stack that made Nora's knees weak. It was a court order from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It stated in dry legalese that in light of new evidence and the death of the primary suspect, all warrants for the arrest of Nora Hale were hereby rescinded. The case was closed. She was exonerated. Nora read the words 3 times. She waited for the joy. Instead, she felt a tidal wave of rage. "It is just paper," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just words. They could have done this years ago. They could have listened to me." She crumpled the document in her fist. "I lost 3 years of my life, Eli. I lost my name. I lost my dignity. And now they send me a piece of paper and say it is all fine?" Eli wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "It is not fine," he said softly. "It will never be fine. But it is over." He turned her in his arms. "They cannot touch you. Nora, not ever again. You are free." Nora looked at the crumpled ball in her hand. She looked at the wanted poster she'd kept hidden in the bottom of her trunk, the tangible proof of her nightmare. "Start the fire," she said. They opened the iron door of the stove. The flames were low, feeding on cedar wood. Nora threw the wanted poster in first. She watched the face. Her face, drawn in fear, curl and blacken. She watched the word murderess turn to ash. Then she threw in the exoneration. Eli raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I do not need their permission to be free," Nora said, watching the seal melt. "I found my freedom here." With the legal chains broken, the future opened up before them like the prairie itself, vast, terrifying, and full of possibility. They sat up late one night, the oil lamp burning low, sketching plans on the back of a ledger page. "We could buy the section to the north," Eli said, tracing a line with a pencil. "Good water there, run more cattle." Nora looked at the map. "It is good land, but I was thinking of something else too." Eli looked up. "What? A school?" Nora said. "Just for the winter months. The children on the outlying homesteads, they grow up wild. Eli, they cannot read. They do not know anything but labor. I could teach them. In the parlor. Eli smiled. It was a slow, spreading smile that reached his eyes. Schoolmarm Nora, he mused. I like the sound of that. He reached across the table and took her hand. What about our own? He asked. Nora's breath hitched. Children? Eli's thumb rubbed the back of her hand. We have got the room. We have got the love. And God knows we have got the stubbornness to raise them right. Nora looked at the scarred man across from her. She thought about a child with his dark eyes and her chin. Yes, she whispered. I would like that, but the family grew sooner than they expected, and not by blood. A week later, a summer storm of biblical fury tore through the valley. It spawned a cyclone that touched down on the Miller homestead, 10 miles east. When the neighbors rode out the next morning, they found the cabin flattened. The parents were gone, buried under the debris. But in the root cellar, huddled under a shelf of potato sacks, they found a boy. His name was Leo. He was 8 years old, skinny as a rail, with eyes that looked like holes burned in a blanket. He didn't speak. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. The town council didn't know what to do with him. The orphanage in Denver was overflowing. Nora heard the news in the Mercantile. She didn't hesitate. She rode out to the sheriff's office where the boy was sitting on a bench, staring at his boots, shivering despite the heat. Nora knelt in front of him. He flinched, pulling back against the wall. I know, Nora said softly. Leo looked up. His eyes were feral with terror. I know what it is like, she continued, keeping her voice low. To have the roof ripped off your world, to think the noise will never stop. She held out a hand. Palm up, open. My name is Nora. I live on a ranch with a man named Eli. He has a lot of scars, and he does not talk much, but he makes the best carved horses you ever saw, and we have a loft room that is quiet. Leo stared at her hand. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched her finger. Eli took the news that they were instant parents with his usual stoicism. He simply nodded, went to the workshop, and started building a smaller bed. Parenting Leo was not a fairy tale. The boy had nightmares that rivaled Nora's. He hoarded food under his pillow. He had a temper that flared like a match, born of grief and confusion. One afternoon, Leo broke a plate in the kitchen. He froze, terrified, waiting for the blow. He curled into a ball, covering his head. Nora saw it, and her heart shattered. She saw herself in the parlor in Boston. She sat on the floor next to him. She didn't touch him. Leo, she said, look at me. The boy peeked out. In this house, Nora said firmly. We do not hit people for accidents. We clean it up. Eli walked in then. He saw the broken china. He saw the boy trembling. He picked up a broom and dustpan. He handed the broom to Leo. You handle the big pieces, Eli said calmly. I will get the dust. Mind your fingers. They worked together, and when it was done, Eli ruffled the boy's hair. Good job, son. That night, Nora watched from the porch as Eli showed Leo how to whittle a stick. The boy was leaning against Eli's knee, focused and safe. We are doing it, Nora whispered to the wind. We are breaking the cycle. The town saw it too. They saw the way the traumatized boy began to fill out, how he started to smile. They saw Nora Hale not as the scandalous woman from the East, but as the mother who had taken in a child no one else wanted. The prejudice didn't vanish. Human nature is too stubborn for that, but it lost its teeth. Nora was no longer a threat. She was a neighbor. In late August, on a day when the air was crisp with the promise of autumn, Nora saddled her horse. I am going for a ride, she told Eli. He looked at her, saw the direction she was facing. Do you want company? No, she said. I need to do this alone, but wait for me, always, he said. She rode to the town graveyard. It was a bleak patch of ground on a rise, fenced with barbed wire to keep the cattle out. The markers were mostly wooden crosses, weathered gray. She found the stone at the edge of the yard. It was simple granite, paid for by the estate. Richard Hale. There were no flowers on the grave. The earth was settling, the grass beginning to reclaim the disturbed soil. Nora stood at the foot of the grave. She waited for the anger. She waited for the fear, but looking at the stone, she felt nothing. He was just a name chiseled in rock. He was bones in a box. He had no power here. The wind did not obey him. The sun did not shine for him. I'm not here to forgive you. Nora spoke to the dirt. I will never forgive you. You took the best years of my youth. You tried to break my spirit. She took a breath, the air sweet with sage. But I am here to tell you that you failed. I am happy, Richard. I am loved, and I am free. You do not own a single inch of me anymore. You are just a story I will tell my children to warn them about men like you. She turned her back on the grave. She walked to her horse and mounted, not looking back. She rode up toward the ridge that overlooked the Carter Ranch. The sun was beginning to set, setting the sky on fire. Eli was waiting for her. He was sitting on his horse, outlined against the burning horizon. She rode up beside him. Their knees touched. "You okay?" he asked. Nora looked out over the valley. She saw the ranch house, the smoke curling from the chimney. She saw Leo playing in the yard with the dogs. She saw the miles of fence they had built together. "I am better than okay," she said. "I am home." Eli reached out and took her hand. "I remember the first time I saw you," he said quietly. "In the snow. You looked like a ghost. I was terrified." "Terrified?" Nora asked. "You? I was scared of wanting you." He admitted, I thought a man like me, with blood on his hands and scars on his soul. I thought I didn't deserve anything soft. I thought I would break you." Nora squeezed his hand. "You didn't break me, Eli. You built me back up." "I ran so hard," she continued, looking at him. "I was so stubborn. I thought safety was a place on a map. I didn't know it was a person." Eli leaned over. He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. The leather of his glove was warm. "I am not going anywhere, Nora, and I am done running," she said. He kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of the dust of the trail and the hope of the harvest. It was deep and long, a sealing of a covenant made not in a church, but in the heart of the wild country. His hand cradled her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and her fingers curled into the front of his shirt, holding on, anchoring him to her. Around them, the land stretched on, harsh, indifferent, beautiful. The wind blew cold from the north. The coyotes began to sing in the canyons. It was not an easy land. It would try to freeze them, burn them, and break them. But as Nora pulled back and looked into Eli's eyes, she knew they would endure. They were like the sagebrush, rooted deep in hard soil, able to weather any storm. "Let's go down," Eli said. "Leo will be hungry." They turned their horses, hand in hand. They rode down the ridge as the twilight deepened into night. Below them, the lights of the ranch house flickered, a small, defiant beacon in the vast darkness. Nora Hale smiled. She rode toward the light, side by side with the cowboy who had shown her that even in the roughest country, some things are worth staying for. Thank you for listening to this story of Nora and Eli. It has been a journey through the snow, the pain, and the ultimate redemption of love in the American West. I hope their story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did Nora find the justice she deserved? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where life was hard but love was harder. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.